Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Again, we are requesting everyone to please proceed to your respective seats for us to begin with the second session, which shall cover the baselines, the territorial sea, and associated navigational regimes. Thank you.
Once again, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. We'd like to request our guests to please proceed back to the seats. You are allowed to bring your coffee and snacks as we will be having a working break and a working session for the session two. Ushers and usherettes, please guide our guests accordingly. Thank you very much.
Once again, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We will be proceeding with our second session for today. And Maps and Sirs, should you have any questions regarding our first session earlier, you may raise it after Professor Long completes the second session. And for you to be recognized, please raise your table bars upright, or you may raise it entirely for you to be recognized. Thank you. And now for our session 2, we shall cover the baselines, the territorial sea, and associated navigational regimes. May we request once again Professor Ronan Long.
Thank you. And look, it's wonderful to be here and to talk a little bit about the story of the law of the sea. And I don't think there could be a more fitting place to discuss this story, and we will have opportunity to have some questions and answers. I got some great questions here during the break, and some questions that don't really have an answer. And certainly people are exploring the really some of these concepts, which is fascinating. Okay, so the second task that I have been set for the next hour or so is to talk a little bit about technical aspects of the law of the sea, baselines, a very important concept in the law of the sea, and I'll explain a little bit about the genesis of baselines and why they're important. I'll speak about the territorial sea, and I will speak about the associated navigational rights and freedoms. And again, I do so without prejudice to the International Maritime Organization or indeed anybody else. I'm here in an academic capacity. Firstly, I think it's important to be familiar with the types of baselines, and we can discuss that. Secondly, we've had really important jurisprudence, both from the International Court of Justice and the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. And everybody in the room needs to be familiar with this, because this jurisprudence is of vital national importance here in the Philippines. I'll turn on some concepts. Firstly, innocent passage in the territorial sea, and we give a very precise legal meaning to this term. Innocent passage is a term of art under the convention. I will also talk to transit passage in international straits. I think everybody in the room, indeed everybody in the world, is acutely aware of how important transit passage is in international straits, such as the Straits of Hormuz. It's an issue of vital international importance in contemporary geopolitical affairs. And then I will talk about the archipelagic sea lane passage, which is mentioned in your domestic and national legislation. And of course, I will talk about archipelagic waters. And archipelagic waters is sui generis. It's unique. It's one of the kinds. And it's important to understand that it is a very distinctive maritime jurisdictional zone, which has a very clear basis in international law. I would add both in treaty law and customary law in relation to archipelagic waters, and I will answer some questions on that. The legal regimes, they say the land dominates the sea, and we saw in the first lecture, really the initial progression in terms of maritime space was in and around the territorial sea. But we see that the convention establishes a maximum extent of the territorial sea to 12 nautical miles, and projected from the baselines. So we can see at the outset the baselines have a huge significance. Beyond the territorial seas, coastal states have discretion to establish a contiguous zone. And Philippines has done so. I pointed that out on the last slide. And a contiguous zone is an enforcement zone related to certain heads of jurisdiction, financial, immigration, sanitary, and customs. They're the heads of jurisdiction, but it's to enforce laws in relation to offences that have been committed in the territorial sea or in the internal waters or within land territory, or indeed offences that may be committed in those zones. So it's a unique, it has some unique legal features. Now, seaward of the territorial sea, we also have the exclusive economic zone. And it's a functional zone where the state exercises sovereign rights in relation to the living resources in the water column, such as fish, and non-living resources in the seabed, such as hydrocarbon or mineral resources. And it has a limit of 200 miles, but in actual fact, it's only 188 miles because the inner 12 miles is territorial sea. Seaward of the territorial sea, we have two very important jurisdictional zones. We have the high seas and we have the international seabed area. And we refer to those as areas beyond national jurisdiction. Now, I also want to reflect on, we have the continental shelf. Continental shelf projects out from land territory, and whether a state has continental shelf or not, it gets 200 miles jurisdiction over the seabed, over the exclusive economic zone provisions. But crucially important for the Philippines, because the Philippines has continental shelf beyond 200 miles. We have an international process for that, and the Philippines has made a submission to the Commission on the limits of the continental shelf and has got a recommendation and has established boundaries beyond 200 miles in relation to that partial submission. And it has a second submission, which is currently before the Commission. So, and that's unique as well, that we have continental shelf where the super adjacent water is high seas, but the continental shelf appertains or belongs to the Philippines, where it exercises sovereign rights in relation to the mineral resources and in the seabed, and indeed sedentary species on the surface of the continental shelf. So 7 jurisdictional zones and 7 different types of regimes apply in those zones. We have to be very careful. Now, in terms of delineating those zones, those zones are delineated from the baselines, and the baselines have 2 broad classifications. Firstly, normal baselines, which is the low water line of coastal states. And I'm going to come back to this because we have had a very important jurisprudence from the International Court on this issue over the past year in 2025 in their climate change advisory opinion. And then we have a second type of baselines, which are straight baselines with rules for bays, rivers, harbour works, low tide elevations, big issue in the South China Sea Annex 7 arbitration, as well as special rules on islands and indeed in relation to reefs. So we'll go through each of these features very briefly. And in the first instance, I would say that the genesis of the straight baseline provisions in the Convention have their origins in a very important case, the Anglo-Norwegian fishery case, before the International Court of Justice in The Hague. And what the court said, it set down 3 criteria in relation to the drawing of baselines, that they have to follow the general direction of the coast. The sea inside those lines must be sufficiently close to the land domain to be subject to the regime of internal waters. And it must also take account certain economic factors and interests. And for instance, in this context, fisheries was a very important context for the International Court to take into account. And on foot of that, the court found that straight baselines were acceptable, and for good reason to do so. There was no other way to enclose the Norwegian coast, which has thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of geographical features and bays and so forth. So it got the imprimatur of the International Court, the system of straight baselines, and really that was taken forward by the negotiators and reflected in Article 7, which is discretionary. Coastal states may draw straight baselines where the coastline is deeply indented or there is a fringe of island that's taken directly out of the jurisprudence, must follow the general direction of the coast, and can't use low tide elevations unless there's a lighthouse or similar installation on them. And the convention doesn't set down any particular length for straight baseline segments. And of course, maybe we can say today that may have been an oversight. Certain states, such as Australia, by way of example, use both types of baselines, both the normal baseline, which is the low water line, as well as straight baselines, as you can see on the map on the slide. Now, a big issue is concerns, is this rule about straight baselines a rule of customary international law? Now, this is a kind of a, for the lawyers who are familiar with this, a customary international law means it would have legal status in international law by virtue of the practice of states and indeed the belief that that practice is legally binding. And now the academic opinion, certainly the academic opinion that I am familiar with, is that state practice varies enormously in relation to straight baselines, and therefore these rules are not binding as a rule of customary international law. I'm sure my academic colleagues in the room may have very different views on this, but I cite that as one example. What I can say is the International Court says that the method of drawing space baselines as codified in the convention must be interpreted restrictively and conform with the normal rules for the determination of baselines. So strict interpretation by the International Court. I think that's a good thing as a lawyer, you know, because then we have clarity. And the reason why we need clarity in the law is we need certainty. So states know what their rights and obligations, and state practice worldwide doesn't adhere not only to the letter of the convention, but doesn't conform to the spirit of the convention. And that's an unspoken word about the package deal. So we have, I can teach a whole class about the practice of states. I'm not going to dwell on that here. We have special rules for river closing lines, and we have special rules for bays. We get hydrographic tests for bays. My students love applying this. We have software to do this, where you compare the area of a semicircle across the natural entrance to the bays with the area of the water area within the bay. And if the water area exceeds the area of the semicircle, then it's a judicial bay. And it can be recognized and is recognized as so under the provisions in the convention. And we have, as I said, really technical software to assist us in doing this nowadays, to make a determination as to whether a judicial bay is a judicial bay, or is it a bay that can't be closed by closing lines under international law. Crucially important, we have very, very specific rules for low tide elevations. And this was the subject matter of the arbitration award. And I demonstrate there on one of the pictures on the slide a low tide elevation not too far away from where I live. It's something when I look out the window of my house in Ireland, if we have low tide, I can see these elevations, and when I come back a couple of hours later, I can't see them. They're submerged. And so we get a very, very succinct definition of low tide elevations. They have to be naturally formed, and I've put it in red there. And we have specific developments in the which have been codified in the convention, where you can use low tide elevations for projecting your territorial sea limits if it's within 12 miles of the coast. And of course, if it's in excess of that, you cannot do that. And we have a ruling from the International Court that low tide of elevation beyond 12 miles, the states can't assert sovereignty in relation to those features. Probably the provision in the convention that has, shall we say, has generated contention are the provisions on islands. And we get a definition in islands, and in the convention, in Article 121, which draws a distinction between islands and rocks, and uses a formulation which perhaps maybe in the 1970s made more sense, but certainly nowadays we see that this provision has provoked not only state practice, but really is the genesis of the South China Sea award by the arbitral tribunals. So, and what's very important to state here is that territorial sea can be projected from an island, exclusive economic zone, a continental shelf, but not so in relation to a rock or other feature. And I cite from the arbitral award what the determination of those features was in the arbitration. Now, it's very important to understand, and my colleagues will take you deeper into this. The arbitration award didn't delve into the issue of sovereignty. It's essentially made a clear division in terms of a determination as to what those features were in the eyes of international law. And it came down quite clearly in relation to that. And you can see it, I've put it on the last indent on my slide in relation to the outcome. So Article 121, I suppose, is going to be dived in. Certainly my distinguished colleague from Wollongong, Clive Schofield, was going to give you a whole lecture on this tomorrow. So please stay around because this is a really important aspect of the two-day symposium. Now, turning next to sea level rise, and sea level rise is an extensionist threat to the existence of states, the existence of islands within archipelagic states, and we have seen the prospect of certain states disappearing. And I certainly know this. I've been to many island states across the world, including the Maldives, and indeed, which has a 2 meter, which is about my height, yeah, from the floor there, is the highest elevation. So one can project and one can model, right, that with sea level rise, that the existence of states is being called into question. And we've also seen that states in the Pacific developed their state practice to reflect a legal response to sea level rise. And they did so by a number of initiatives. It's not coming up. Maybe somebody back there can help me. Okay. So I suppose, to my knowledge, Marshall Islands were first to do this, where they codified their maritime limits, they codified their baselines, and that codification took up 560 pages. And they fixed their limits on foot of that, and they sent those copies of those limits to the United Nations. And that practice was followed by a number of states, including Nauru, Kiribati, Tuvalu, FSM, Solomon Islands, Palau, and PMG, where they would fix their limits irrespective of sea level rise. And then they had a very important political declaration on maritime zones, in the face of climate change related sea level rise. All right, so here we see an example, a most cogent example perhaps that we have in the law of the sea, where the law of the sea has to respond to the dynamics of the changing world. In this instance, human-induced climate change and sea level rise. And what was crucially important is we have had 2 rulings on climate change, one in the tribunal and one in the International Court of Justice in 2025. I will talk a little bit about the ruling in 2025 in relation to baselines and charts, because it's crucially important for the Philippines, which is facing the effects of human-induced climate change. And these effects are not, they don't have their origins here in the Philippines, they have their origins in countries where I come from and where I live. So you're dealing with problems that have been created elsewhere. And it's very important, I think, this issue of equity and fairness and statehood was really at the heart of the jurisprudence that we had from the International Court on Climate Changes. And so what the court said, and I'll paraphrase, but in the interest of accuracy, I've put the precise paragraphs of the jurisprudence that's relevant to this particular issue on the slide. But I'll paraphrase it. What the court said was, although states have an obligation under the convention to lodge their baselines and coordinates of their limits on navigational charts with the United Nations Secretary General, the court says there's no obligation for states to update those charts. And that's a crucially important development. And it allows states, and it supports the practice of those states in the Pacific that have fixed their maritime limits and indeed have submitted those limits to the UN. And it's a very brave decision by the International Court in many ways, and very compelling jurisprudence. The preponderance of legal opinion was on the other side, and which is interesting, yeah. And I like what's quite striking, because I read the paragraphs again last night, is the brevity of the jurisprudence and, shall we say, the philosophical underpinnings on equity and fairness, right? That if a state is facing the issues of sea level rise in the context of its very existence and statehood, then it shouldn't be denied recourse to international law. So this is really one of the great progressive developments. Of course, it's an advisory opinion, but it has huge weight by virtue of the number of states that were involved in the proceedings, including the Philippines. So I take cognizance of that in your own minds, that although we said in international law these limits are ambulatory or move by virtue of the geographical features that they're projected from, the International Court says you can fix them. Now, I've written about this, and I pointed out maybe a slight lacuna in the judgment that states have to update their navigational charts for IMO, SOLAS convention and regulations. So, which the judgment doesn't address, which is disappointing. But I was very happy to learn last week that Australia has 2 sets of charts, one for the projection of maritime limits and a second set of charts for navigational purposes, so I think there's a solution that meets both the IMO requirements and the legitimacy and the equity arguments put forward by the International Court in its advisory opinion, which is crucially important. Now, I have 2 or 3 topics to cover with you, which are inherently important. Firstly, this concept of innocent passage, which is articulated very clearly in Articles 17 and 20. And underpinning the innocent passage, I suppose, was a compromise between the freedom of navigation in the territorial sea. And I'd start by saying something quite controversial, maybe in some eyes. But if you take a very literal reading of the provisions in the Convention on Innocent Passage, is these apply to all ships. And certainly on a literal interpretation, all ships is all ships, including naval vessels. But I'm sure, and indeed the practice of states doesn't reflect that. I would, in several instances. It is innocent passage is in relation to surface passage only, and it can't be made contingent on or conditioned on prior notification, and indeed submarines or other underwater vehicles have to travel on the surface. So if you have a drone as submersible, it has to travel on the surface on the territorial sea, and in the case of submarines under Article 20, it must fly its flag. Relatively clear so far. Now, what we get the convention is we get two forms of lists. Firstly, we get a text-based interpretation of what is innocent, and it is a passage that's not prejudicial to peace, good order, and security of the coastal state. You're saying, okay, I can understand that. Is that capable of objective determination? Surely that's quite a subjective on part of the states. And I would say, well, our answers can be found in paragraph 2 of Article 19, where it lists out a whole range of activities which are considered to be prejudicial to the good order and security of the coastal state. I wouldn't go through the list, but I would highlight one, which is L. It's on the slide, and it says there, any activity that has a bearing on passage. So it's arguable that this is an open-ended list, and academic commentators cite this provision otherwise. We also get a list of activities which the coastal state can regulate in relation to passage, innocent passage, including the safety and navigation, and indeed the provision of navigational aids and protection of cables and pipelines, conservation of living resources. And one issue they can't regulate is the standards and equipment borne by ships, unless they're reflective of generally accepted international rules and standards. Generally accepted international rules and standards are the rules adopted by the International Maritime Organization. And the reason that's in the convention is to ensure that we've one set of global rules for that, as opposed to the large number of coastal states in the world designing their own rules for vessels in relation to exercising innocent passage. I suppose something which is very topical in relation to innocent passage is that states can't impose, and this is a general provision, can't impose requirements which have their practical effect of denying or impeding innocent passage, and they can't charge for passage. And that has come right up to the top of the international agenda again over the last number of weeks in the context of transit passage through international straits. We also get a very important provision, which is what measures that states may take in terms of preventing non-innocent passage, as well as the rights and entitlements to suspend or to protect security, including weapons exercises. We have certain conditions set down, and I cite some of those conditions on the slide, such as those suspensions should be temporary and essential for security and to a specific area and duly published. So if there is a naval vessel, a foreign naval vessel exercising passage, but this passage is deemed to be non-innocent with the regulations of the coastal state, and we have a formulation in the convention. Of course, common sense and wisdom has to prevail and the vessel can be asked to leave if the passage is not innocent, and obviously if it disregards compliance, then by virtue of disregarding compliance, this is would be deemed to be non-innocent. And quite clearly, the first port to call here, metaphorically speaking, is diplomatic means, and it happens quite regularly. And of course, there's the principle of minimum force, a very important issue in all aspects of international law. Now, turning next to transit passage, I see even in Ireland, my daughter's become an expert on transit. She's a medical doctor, and she's become an expert on transit passage by virtue of the Straits of Hormuz, and it's something which is the currency of international diplomacy and negotiation. But what I would emphasize to this room here is transit passage is crucial to the international rules-based international order. That was cited by Rear Admiral Torelli this morning, and it was fundamental to the negotiation of the convention, and it applies to straits used for international navigation, which connect one part of the EEZ or with another part of the EEZ, or one part of the high seas with another part of the high seas. We have well in excess of 100 international straits worldwide where transit passage is being exercised right this moment. So it's something which is absolutely essential for navigational rights and freedoms worldwide. And I just would like to emphasize that, given the importance of the Philippines and international affairs. The safeguarding of transit passage is absolutely essential to a rules-based international order as it applies to the ocean. Now, we get some certain exceptions, and I've put them on the slide. I can talk to the exceptions maybe separately. I don't propose to go through these, where we have a non-suspendable innocent passage, and these were to respond to certain exceptions that were flagged in the negotiations. The issue, of course, doesn't arise in the first exception, which is if the strait is less than 24 miles wide, then it doesn't come within the territorial sea of the strait states. So there's always going to be a seaway there where states can exercise their navigational rights without resorting to transit passage under the international regime. And the other two examples I use is the Tirana Gulf of Aqaba example, as well as an island bordering a mainland where we have these exceptions. And I can take some questions on that. Transit passage can be exercised by ships and submarines and aircraft. It's unimpeded, it's continuous, and it's expeditious. It's normal mode of transport, and literature supports can be either surface, air, subsurface, and it's shoreline to shoreline, and it's non-suspendable in terms of the powers of the strait states. Normal mode, and if you read the American literature, it's very clear in this. I teach in the United States, and certainly lectured in the United States, Naval War College, in Newport, Rhode Island, and indeed in Harvard Law School. They take a very strong view on this. They see it as being essential for the projection of naval power worldwide and security concerns, that these strait regimes, transit rights are preserved. And obviously, we have certain prescriptive requirements. I've set them out. I've paraphrased them on the left side. No substitute for reading the text, yeah? So be careful with the shorthand, and examples would be not to threaten to use force, not engage in marine scientific research, comply with the collision regulations, that's clear to all seafarers, comply with international pollution control standards, and obviously this requirement about proceeding without delay. Coastal state or the strait states can take measures and adopt regulations on issues such as safety and navigation, prevention of pollution, conservation of living resources, including fishing, loading and unloading, and convention of FISC, customs, fiscal, immigration, sanitary laws of the coastal state. I'll just go back one slide there. One of the big issues for international lawyers, and I'm sure it's subject matter of the negotiations between the United States and Iran currently, are these rules rules of customary international law? And that's a big issue for a non-party to the convention such as the United States. The United States has always argued that these rights existed prior to the convention, and that it's supported by the practice of straight sense. And by the way, we have special rules for special states such as the Turkish Straits under the Montreux Convention. And so, and I'm sure my colleagues here, distinguished academic colleagues, all have views on this. So it's an important consideration for non-parties to the convention. And United Kingdom House of Lords report on this 2 years ago took a very firm view that these were rules of customary international law. That is to say, they have a legal existence, a legal life outside the convention or outside the actions of states parties to the convention. Now, turning next to, by the way, transit passage, they're about a month before the crisis in the Middle East blew up. I wrote an article based on a paper I gave to the legal advisors at the UN last year about navigational rights and freedoms. And I said, all of this is settled. The practice of states is very consistent. This is something we can be very happy about. And of course, 4 weeks later, we had this closing of the Straits of Hormuz, and that impacted on the global economy. So you have to be careful what you write about. And, there's no guarantees about future state practice, unfortunately. And this is an example. Lastly, I turn to the archipelagic state. And firstly, I'd say about archipelagic state is we get a definition in the convention, and it's wonderfully drafted. And I was reading what Satya Nandan had to say about it last night, and it really reflects the delegation of the Philippines, Indonesia, Mauritius, Fiji, and believe it or not, sponsored by Great Britain as it then was, as to what constituted an archipelagic state. And and you have to read the definition because there are component parts in it. A state consisting wholly of one or more archipelagos and can include other islands. And wholly, we can think, obviously, classical archipelagic state is the Philippines. Other examples of more than one group of archipelagos, we can think of the Solomon Islands has 5 archipelagos, each of which has been enclosed by archipelagic baselines. And we have some other examples. I think, and I stand to be corrected in this, that we have at least 22 states that have claimed archipelagic statehood in international law. And why others haven't done so is because of a number of difficult requirements that we set down in international law pertaining to claiming archipelagic statehood. And indeed, the first thing I would say is that we get very specific technical requirements in relation to archipelagic baselines. In principle, they have to not exceed 100 nautical miles in terms of each segment. But there's an exception to that 3% of the lines can go to 125 nautical miles. And low tide elevations are not allowed for the construction or the determination of archipelagic baselines unless there's a lighthouse or a similar feature or is within, the feature itself is within 12 miles of the coast of an island. And then quite controversially was this formulation that the land-to-sea ratio has to be between 1:1 and 1:9. Now, 1:1 was to exclude states such as the United Kingdom, New Zealand, dare I say it, Japan, and others. So their land-to-sea ratio would fall foul of that. Then 1:9 is the more difficult or contentious parts. That's saying 9 parts sea to 1 part land, and that was to exclude these very large oceanic states. And I stand corrected on this. Maybe an example would be Palau. So again, but there's a formulation there that archipelagic states is quite a technical exercise, and we have jurisprudence that states that are not archipelagic states can't claim archipelagic statehood, and that's a very important consideration in because we've had a number of submissions of states trying to assert archipelagic baselines and archipelagic baseline criteria in international dispute settlement bodies, and clearly that is at odds with the convention. A good example, archipelagic state of Indonesia, your near neighbor. You can see extensive use of archipelagic baselines, and within those archipelagic baselines, you have archipelagic waters, and then you have designated archipelagic sea lanes, where you have archipelagic sea lane passage, which has its own jurisdictional basis. And archipelagic waters, and be very clear in this, it has to be true to what the Philippines negotiated, what is reflected in Part 4, and is clearly articulated in the statement they delivered to the international community in Montego Bay on the 10th of December 1982. And archipelagic waters are all waters within baselines. It's neither internal waters, and that's very important in the context of saying it's not territorial sea. It's sui generis, it's unique, it's one of a kind, and it's a very important development in international law. And then following on from that, archipelagic states enjoy sovereignty over the waters and the seabed and the subsoil. And we have had some quite important jurisprudence from UNCLOS that the archipelagic states such as Sao Tome Principe have to adopt measures which are reasonable in specific contexts, and including reflecting necessity and proportionality. And Justice Carpio would be very familiar with how courts determine what's reasonable and what is necessary, and they generally determine these on a very objective basis, certainly in the context of international law. So in this instance, the issue of bunkering quite clearly came within the scope of the archipelagic state regime, but the sanctions that were being invoked were deemed to be unreasonable in that particular instance. You have to respect the other rights of states, and we have certain provisions detailing existing agreements, neighbouring states, seabed cables, and obviously we have in the context of existing agreements, we have some very good examples under fisheries. And then it's important to say we have very specific navigational rights, the rights of innocent passage, in terms of archipelagic waters, and then we have a new construct in international law, archipelagic sea lane passage, which is crucially important for the Philippines, because you have asserted your international law rights in identifying where those sea lanes are, and indeed I will indicate them on one of my closing slides. So I suppose, right, there is one or two points I would make, is that the convention itself is a compromise. It reflects a balance of interests. And archipelagic states and archipelagic statehood is enshrined in international law. And within that, archipelagic states gained control, sovereignty in relation to archipelagic waters. But obviously, this was balanced by certain navigational rights and in relation to other or foreign states in terms of archipelagic sea lane passage in particular. And I suppose it's crucial in that context that archipelagic states recognize the rights of international navigation and indeed the rights of overflight in relation to designated sea lanes. And we do have a process for that. These sea lanes, you can visualize it as a maximum extent of 50 miles up between a central axis, 25 miles either side of the axis, and we have a 10% rule if the features don't allow for 50 miles in that. Normal mode, archipelagic sea lane passage entitles foreign vessels to exercise their navigational rights and indeed the rights of overflight, and they do so continuously. Innocent passage through the territorial sea, innocent passage through the archipelagic waters. Submarines must navigate on the surface and show their flag, and there's no right of overflight over archipelagic waters apart from archipelagic sea lanes. We also have very specific rights and entitlements, the duties of archipelagic or vessels exercising archipelagic sea lane passage, and we have very specific duties set out by the Convention in relation to the rights and entitlements of archipelagic states. And what's odd is we don't get any express enforcement powers in the Convention. We also, the Convention, and this is a general criticism, I would say, it's a personal criticism. Convention's quite silent on damage and on liability, and I'm really happy in many respects that this issue is addressed in national legislation here in the Philippines, the issue of liability for damage and the issue of damage itself. And that's every lawyer in the room knows without having provisions pertaining to damage to the marine environment, then these rights and entitlements may be subject to subject to the practice of states, which is not in conformity with the obligations arising under the Convention or in general international law. Lastly, I would say the process for designating archipelagic sea lanes is a process which there is oversight by the International Maritime Organization, but the genesis of this is with the archipelagic states. I would make one further point on this, which was made by Ambassador Satyanandan, and it was made by, certainly would have been by the Philippines delegation at the third conference, is this is discretionary on the part of archipelagic states. It's a may, if you read the provisions in the Convention, and I'm very happy as an international lawyer to see states such as the Philippines living up to its international obligations and adopting and proposing archipelagic sea lanes. And you have set that out in a statute, and I cite it on the slide. I think I'm nearly done. Just maybe a quick comparison on navigational rights in terms of innocent passage on the right-hand side of the slide, and on archipelagic sea lane passage on the left-hand of the side. We see overflight is allowed, none in relation to innocent passage. Submarines submerged, it's a very important issue for maritime security in archipelagic sea lanes. Surface passage and flying the flag. Normal operations in archipelagic sea lanes. Restricted observations. We saw in the Article 19 the prescriptive lists we get in the convention, and for example, certainly maritime states would argue the big maritime powers, that includes launching and recovering of aircraft, no such rights when vessels are exercising innocent passage. So minimal, shall we say, on a comparative basis with the restrictions that appertain under innocent passage regimes. Lastly, I have this Ambassador Jalal, a very famous international negotiator. I had great pleasure in talking, working, and meeting him in Indonesia. Great friend of the Philippines, great international negotiator, and he, a fundamental personality at the Third Law of the Sea conference. And what he says, right, in his writings is the psychological feeling of its various islands and seas between them being universally accepted as one unit is no mean gain. And I think that should resonate when you're thinking about archipelagic statehood, and indeed the whole concept of archipelagic waters, archipelagic baselines, and so forth. So a nice quotation to finish on. Conclusions, I think you've been successful. Your negotiator achieved what they set out to do, and you have honored your international obligations in terms of asserting your rights and entitlements in relation to archipelagic statehood, as well as in terms of honoring your obligations in relation to archipelagic sea lanes, and that is a process that's underway at the international maritime organizations. And I argued in the article that I wrote that this is a success story. We live in a very negative world, and the currency of international diplomacy is negativity. And we should rejoice in success. And this is one of the great successes of international lawyers, of international negotiators, delegations such as those from the Philippines, Indonesia, Mauritius, Fiji, that set out very clearly what they wanted in the negotiations and achieve consensus on that, and have gone forward to honor those obligations in international law. I have a colleague, Dean of the Law School, has a question. Gatula. Yes. Thank you.
You were talking earlier about Professor and that about the fact that there's supposed to be a difference in approach, philosophical approach on international law with regard to the Eurocentric view on the law of the sea and on the Asian way of the law of the sea. Could you expound more on that? Because perhaps the differences are more apparent than real.
Yeah.
And if so, would it justify China's approach to the law of the sea? Thank you.
Yeah, this is a wonderful question, and we could design a whole university program around this. So I think Professor Anand, in the origin and development of the law of the sea, his start point was to debunk a couple of theories, which is firstly that this was navigational freedoms was a European-centric approach to the development of international law. And he said, if you look at customs and practice elsewhere in the world, navigational freedoms were prevalent in the Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia from ancient times. Yeah, so and I think that's a very compelling argument. Now, and the reason why you put forward that argument was really that the codification and development of international law shouldn't be seen exclusively through the prism of a European interests and its genesis there, that it should reflect the interests of newly independent states of Asia and Africa. And that's crucially important. And by the way, that's the kind of the very foundation to the third world approaches to international. Believe you me, I have students in the university that do their PhDs through the prism of third world approaches to international law. And I find it very illuminating because they can highlight interests and arguments that perhaps wouldn't be prevalent through other interpretations of international law. And I'm sure my colleagues have different views. To answer the substance of your question, I think the outcome is still freedom in terms of the start point. So whether it's Mer Liberum, Hugo Grotius, or freedoms in the Southeast Asia, Indian Ocean, or Pacific, start point was freedoms. And since then, we've had the progressive development of international law around the interests of coastal states and the pushing out of maritime limits and so forth. So thank you very much, Admiral. Thank you. And your distinguished colleague, thank you very much, De Castro. It's wonderful. Thank you, Mr. De Castro.
I'm Professor De Castro. I am an academic, but I am not a lawyer.
Okay.
So my question refers to, can you give an overview of China's participation during the negotiations for UNCLOS? And of course, were there any indication that, in the 21st century, China will be undermining the very spirit of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea?
Wow, it's as an international lawyer, I'm not really competent to answer or give you a kind of a subjective viewpoint. But I will say a few things more or less on the general context. So thank you for the provocative question, first and foremost, Professor. You have friends in the audience when you get asked questions like that. Okay, so what I would say is that the negotiations were conducted in a geopolitical setting of a bipolar world, East versus West. That provided the geopolitical context. And the predominant powers, and we have political scientists here who can speak to this topic much better than I can. The predominant powers on the west side was the United States, particularly for the navigational rights and freedoms. These were deal breakers for them, and they exerted a huge influence in the negotiations. But strangely and bizarrely enough, they were able to achieve a détente with the Soviet Union when they were addressing issues of core concern to both the Soviet Union and the United States. So believe it or not, before the convention came into force, there was an incident in the Black Sea bumping incidents, where a US Navy ship collided with a Soviet ship and in the Black Sea. And United States Navy said they were exercising their rights under international law. And at that state, neither state was party to the convention, but they resolved the dispute and footed the rules in the convention. And they said, well, this is the basis for going forward, which was really, it gave the rules the imprimatur of the two powers. The China has really only come to the fore in international law of the sea elements as a relatively new development. And I can say that, and again, that's relative. But when I would have traveled to China 25 years ago, there was only one or two lawyers with international law training on law of the sea matters. And Professor Fu in the University of Xiamen, notable, he'd been trained in Virginia by Professor John Martin Moore, who was leader of the UN delegation at the third conference for most of the conference. So that was one of his most distinguished students was from China, and he really set up that school in Xiamen. Now, what I see when I go to China, and I speak every year at their annual conference, is that they've had a tsunami of interest in international law and international law of the sea. I think Professor Wu, a leading exponent, has 60 PhD students working on law of the sea issues. Their delegation is very powerful now in international negotiations. their delegation was a deal making delegation for the BBNJ negotiations, and they had certain red line issues for BBNJ, but once they got over those red line issues, they were willing to support the treaty. Now, at the same time, and I'm speaking in personal capacity there are other powers in the world that were very dominant on in intergovernmental negotiations, and they have receded in terms of some of the very important multilateral negotiations and have withdrawn from intergovernmental bodies. So there is a vacuum there, and I think that vacuum is being closed by certain states worldwide. I won't mention who. So maybe one final point, Professor, is that, and I talked to Bernard Oxman last week from the State Department, a council, I think, in the Annex 7 arbitration award. And he's very good on the bilateral issue between the United States and the Soviet Union. He spoke about this last week, about at the height of the Cold War, they could work together to get what they needed to get done through the intergovernmental processes. And he said last week, and I've no reason to doubt him, is that transit passage was a deal breaker for the United States. And likewise, they could live with archipelagic statehood and archipelagic sea lanes, although this was discretionary, the designation. They felt that they had built up this bona fide trust system with archipelagic states that they would go ahead and honor their obligations. So that only partly answers your question, I know, but I'm subject to limitations is what I can say here in a public forum. Thank you, Professor. Is there somebody else in the room? Somebody, this lady has an Irish grandchild, so I am so happy that you're in the room.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Long, for such a comprehensive presentation. Mine is more of a comment than a question, but if you would like to expound on what I'm going to say, I would really appreciate it. Let me go back to some elements of your presentation where states can possess only what they can control, which led to the Dominus Maris, the 3-mile rule. Also, the European-centric system, the Westphalian system, and the U.S. jurisdictional control over the continental shelf. One common thread in all these principles is the principle of state power, the strength of a country that will determine its role in the convention. And I say all this because this should be in the context of the dynamics between the Philippines and China, because its country's role in the oceans. Thank you, Professor. Appreciate it very much.
Yeah, it's a great question. I can actually answer this question, so I'm happy to say. So I think, right, the issues that you projected there are the examples you gave in terms of Truman Proclamation over the continental shelf, the 3-mile limit, and so forth, are reflective of where there's a vacuum in international law, where we don't have unified rules. But clearly we don't, we're no longer there, right? So, and I thought that was articulated really well this morning. It's the convention sets out a rules-based international legal order. It has the support of 172 parties, it's 171 states, and the European Union. It has brought peace and security to the world, but the premise, it's contingent on the states upholding their international obligations. Now, we have a saying for lawyers, it's a Latin saying, I come back to the Europeans, pacta sunt servanda. You know, international agreements are there to be observed by states, and I think that's the crucial issue. I'd go one step further, and there's a real risk that we could unravel the convention by selectively a la carte going back and underlying the philosophical underpinnings of the agreement as a package deal. So it's not like that I can go down to the restaurant tonight and choose anything on the menu and decide, well, I'm not having the rest of it. In the context of the convention, you have to take the package, and the discretions afforded to states are like the provisions of the convention are clear for international lawyers, and it's and in particular some of the issues that have been articulated in, and this is the real strength of the Annex 7 arbitration. It clarifies issues where there was doubt as to, and that the practice of states was deviating from certain interpretations of the convention that perhaps were more true to its black letter law, and indeed to the spirit of the convention. So, speaking from a jurisprudential point, the Annex 7 arbitration brought a lot of clarity and certainty in relation. We cite this continuously, and it has been cited continuously in jurisprudence ever since. And just as Carpio will tell you, right, certainly in legal systems, the common law systems, the issue of precedence is very important. But the issues in terms of what constitutes the general duty of to protect and preserve the marine environment, we get very clear guidance in relation to the scope of that general requirements, and indeed we even get very clear clarity as to what is the marine environment in the Annex 7 arbitration. It includes the biodiversity, it includes the ecosystem, it includes clams, and it quite clearly sets down the procedural requirements of undertaking EIA, and that EIA being transparent and notified to the international community. So, shall we say, the clarity that comes from the jurisprudence it sheds light on perhaps provisions of the convention. In some instances, they were open to interpretation, but in other instances, they were absolutely clear to anybody that is an international lawyer. So some of the issues that were litigated were, didn't need to go to an arbitration. They're absolutely clear in international law. So thank you for that. Great question. And I'm conscious that it's 11:38, 11:40. And I've been up here for 2 hours. So thank you. After getting off a flight from Greece. I'm going to be around for a few days, so I'm happy to take questions in here. I'm also working the university, so you're free to contact me in the university anytime. It's been a privilege and honor. We get some wonderful students from the Philippines every year. Some of the best students I had in my class this year were from the Philippines. So you should be very proud of your youth. They're doing a wonderful job internationally and in our university, and you're laying the foundation for a great new generation, and you're taking your law to sea obligations very seriously, and that's a very good thing. Thank you very much.
Once again, thank you very much, Professor Ronan Long.
There we go, ladies and gentlemen. We've just concluded the session 1 and session 2 for today's activity. The next session is something that everyone is looking forward to as well. We'll be proceeding to lunch. So for lunch, please proceed to ballrooms 2 and 3, and we'll be back at around 1:30 p.m. this afternoon. So to everyone, good morning and have a great lunch. Once again, we'll be proceeding to ballroom 2 and 3. Ushers and usherettes, please guide them accordingly.